them and said to Jephthah, "Why did you cross over to fight against the Ammonites and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house over you with fire." In Judges 8:1, we see that Ephraim was upset with Gideon for not calling them to fight. Here it is again, the unreasonable annoyance of the Ephraimites toward another tribe, a brother tribe. And they're so mad and jealous that they threaten to burn his house down with him in it. They should have been congratulating Jephthah. Instead, they're complaining against him. The cause of this annoyance is pride. Jephthah is from the tribe of Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh were brothers. They were Joseph's two sons. In Genesis 48, Jacob, which is Joseph's father, he blesses these two sons, but rather than giving the older son Manasseh the blessing that was due to him, he says that Ephraim, the younger son, will be greater than the first. And this pride of being chosen first has gone to their heads now. Ephraim felt that they were the chosen tribe, no matter what. Verse 2. And Jephthah said to them, "I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites, and when I called you, you didn't save me from their hand. And when I saw that you would not save me, I took my life in my hand and crossed over against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me?" Jephthah gives his response and reminds them of four things. Number one, he didn't do this for his glory, but he did it to defend his people. Number two, he asked them to come, but they didn't come. He didn't need them, nor was he obligated to call on them, which makes their lack of response all the more infuriating. Number three, this was a big job, and they should be giving Jephthah respect for this victory that he risked his life for. And lastly, the most important, number four, Jephthah gives the credit back to God. He's basically saying, if God was pleased to use me to gain a victory, who are you to be offended by it? Take it up with God if you're really that upset. Now, this doesn't go over well with the Ephraimites, and we can see it in their response in verse 4. Then Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim, and the men of Gilead struck Ephraim because they said, "You are fugitives of Ephraim, you Gileadites, in the midst of Ephraim and Manasseh." We have to work backward to figure out their response. What they said was, "You are fugitives of Ephraim." In other words, who cares about you, you're scum of the earth? But the Gileadites are just as much true Israelites. So this rubs them the wrong way. And it's because of this statement we see that Jephthah gathers all the men of Gilead and fights against Ephraim. The words of Ephraim are hurtful and they're invalid. They incite a harsh battle between these brother tribes. Verse 5. And the Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites. And when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, "Let me go over," the men of Gilead said to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" When he said no, they said to him, "Then say Shibboleth." And he said Sibboleth, for he couldn't pronounce it right. Then they seized him and slaughtered him at the fords of the Jordan. At that time, 42,000 of the Ephraimites fell. In verse 5, I see the word fugitive again, but this time it's referring to the men of Ephraim. The Gileadites are kicking butt and taking names. They knew the river passages probably better than any of the other tribes, so they set up guards at the river banks with orders to kill every Ephraimite who tried to cross and escape. And the way they figured out who was an Ephraimite was how they spoke. They all spoke a similar language, but there were different dialects within the regions. They were told to say the word Shibboleth. If they refused to say it, or they said it without the sh sound, it would sound like Sibboleth. So if they refused or they said Sibboleth, they were killed. Isn't it interesting that the mouth is what got them into the mess in the first place by calling them Gileadites as a derogatory name, calling them fugitives, not giving them honor and putting them down. Now it's their mouth again, but this time it's used against them, resulting in their death. 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at the riverbanks. Our mouth is powerful. It's a powerful weapon that can be used for good or great evil. James 3:6 spells out clearly how the small tongue can bring big consequences. Verse 7, Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in his city in Gilead. This is the end of Jephthah's story. He judged Israel for 6 years, and then he died, and he's buried. Moving on to verse 8. After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters he gave in marriage outside his clan, and 30 daughters he brought in from outside for his sons, and he judged Israel 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried at Bethlehem. A couple notes to make here about Ibzan. He is from Bethlehem, most likely the Bethlehem in Judah. The New Testament calls this Judah David's city. And there's 3 exceptional things to note about Ibzan. He had 60 children. That's the first exceptional thing. The second exceptional thing about him is that he had 30 sons and 30 daughters. He had equal amounts of both sons and daughters. And the third exceptional thing about Ibzan is that he married them all. He saw them all get married. And this implies that he lived a very long time to see 60 of your children married. And these marriages worked in his favor. It says that he gave his daughters in marriage outside of his clan, and that he allowed his sons to marry outside of his clan. This would have afforded him numerous alliances, which would have caused him to be a good candidate to lead the people. And he ends up judging Israel for 7 years. He died and he was buried in Bethlehem. Let's move on to the next judge in verse 11. After him, Elon the Zebulunite judged Israel, and he judged Israel 10 years. Then Elon the Zebulunite died and was buried at Aijalon in the land of Zebulun. Elon is from Zebulun, which is north of Canaan. He judges Israel for 10 years. He dies and he's buried in Zebulun. One theologian that I studied said that it was in the beginning of Elon's rule that the 40 years of oppression from the Philistines began. And so also about this time, Samson would have been born, and we're going to get to Samson in the next chapter. Verse 13, after him, Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys, and he judged Israel 8 years. Then Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, died and was buried at Pirathon in the land of Ephraim, in the hill country of the Amalekites. Abdon was mostly known for his numerous offspring. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons, all of which he watched grow up and ride on 70 donkeys. Again, as in chapter 10, verse 4, these men riding on donkeys would mean they were acting as traveling judges or officials for Israel. Abdon served 8 years during the beginning of the Philistine rule. And as we close chapter 12, it's important to notice that not much is mentioned of a high priest during these stories of the judges. The high priest is now intended to be replaced by a new high priest. This foreshadows the coming of Jesus. The foolishness of the people that we've read about shows us even more the need for the gospel to be clearly revealed through the ultimate high priest, which is Jesus. And when that happens, that changes everything.